The wagon came at daybreak, when the dew still clung to the grass and the kitchen fires were just being lit. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, that peculiar scent of morning on a plantation, when the world was still deciding whether to be kind or cruel. She held her son close, 4 years old, small enough to fit against her chest, his breath warm on her neck. His fingers clutched at her sleeve, innocent and trusting, unaware that this embrace would be their last for longer than either could imagine. The trader stood in the yard with papers already signed, money already counted. He was a thin man with hard eyes and hands that had handled too many transactions like this one. His wagon waited behind him, its red-painted wheels catching the early light, one spoke visibly split from some past journey. The overseer pointed at the boy, his face as expressionless as the account books he kept in the main house office. That one. Now, she didn't scream. Screaming brought the whip, brought punishment that lasted days, brought attention from the master's house that made everything worse. But her hands shook as she gripped her son's sleeve, feeling the rough cotton between her fingers, memorizing the weight of him against her body, trying to burn this moment into her mind so deeply that time could never erase it. He looked up at her with eyes too trusting, too young to understand what was breaking, what was being torn apart in this dusty yard, while the rest of the world continued its ordinary mourning. The overseer stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. Let go. Her fingers found a loose thread at the bow's sleeve and pulled quick, desperate, a mother's instinct to keep some piece of her child. A small strip of fabric tore free, yellow-brown with age and wear, frayed at the edges where the stitching had begun to fail. She pressed it into her palm and whispered against her son's hair, one line repeated like a sacred incantation, over and over. Lord, keep him breathing till I find him. Lord, keep him breathing till I find him. The trader's hand closed on the bow's shoulder, firm and final. Her son reached back for her, his small fingers grasping at air, calling out in a voice that would echo in her dreams for 15 years. Mama. The overseer shoved her away, his hand rough on her arm. Quiet, you want worse. She fell to her knees in the dirt, the ribbon clenched in her fist so tight that her nails cut into her palm, the prayer still moving on her lips like breathing. The wagon wheels creaked forward, that distinctive sound of wood and metal that she would hear in nightmares. Her son's face turned back toward her, confusion breaking into fear as the distance between them grew. She ran after the wagon, barefoot, the dust rising thick and choking, coating her throat, filling her lungs. She ran until the overseer caught her arm and dragged her back, his grit bruising. Enough. She stood in the yard afterward, blind with dust and tears, the ribbon pressed so tight against her palm it left a red mark that would take hours to fade. The kitchen hands watched from the porch, their faces carefully blank, knowing better than to show sympathy where the overseer could see it. The dogs paced at the yard edge, uneasy with the emotional charge in the air. No one spoke, no one moved. The morning continued around her as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't just split in two. That night, she lay on her pallet in the cabin she shared with 3 other women, and she hummed a lullaby she used to sing when her son couldn't sleep, when nightmares woke him, when fever made him restless. The tempo was slow, steady, the kind that matched a child's heartbeat when fear made it race. She hummed it over and over, imagining he could still hear it somewhere, imagining his breathing matched hers across whatever distance now stretched between them. The sound became her prayer, her promise, her defiance against the darkness. The old stable hand, a man named Samuel who'd seen 30 years of sales and separations, who'd watched families torn apart with the regularity of seasons changing, sat outside her door that night, keeping watch. He'd lost 3 children himself to the trade, sold south before the laws tightened, before anyone pretended to care about keeping families together. You planning to run? He asked quietly through the thin cabin wall. No. I'm planning to remember. Remember what? Everything, every detail, every word, every face. If I can't read or write, then I'll be a ledger myself. I'll store it all where they can't burn it or steal it or forge it. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, that's the hardest kind of survival. Keeping memory alive when everything pushes you to forget. I know. But it's all I have. The next morning, while the overseer was occupied with a delivery at the main house, she scratched the trader's name into a hidden board beneath the kitchen step, using a nail she'd pocketed from the repair pile. She'd heard the name spoken once, barked across the yard when the papers were signed. Loud enough for her to catch it. Drummond. South Carolina trade route. She carved it carefully, each letter a small act of resistance. She carved the wagon mark too, that red painted wheel with the split spoke she'd seen when the dust finally cleared and the wagon was far down the road. Her fingernail bled from the effort, leaving red smears on the woe, but the marks stayed. They would stay. She would make sure they stayed. The preacher, a quiet man named Elijah, who moved between plantations with him, books and whispered news, who carried messages in ways the overseers never quite understood, found her that afternoon. He sat on the step above her scratch marks, his voice low and careful, his eyes scanning the yard for anyone who might be listening. Coded hymns travel farther than letters, he said, as if commenting on the weather. And passes are being tightened, the laws changing after 1850. The Fugitive Act makes crossing state lines deadly without proper papers. You understand, she nodded. She didn't need to understand all the details of law. She needed to understand cruelty, separation, and survival, and she already did. Can you hum that lullaby again? He asked. She hummed it, soft and steady, the tempo exactly as she'd sung it the night before and every night of her son's life. Elijah listened carefully, his head tilted, counting the beats. Then he nodded. Good. If he hears it someday, he'll know, even if he doesn't remember your face, even if years make everything else fade, he'll know that sound. Music lives in the body longer than memory lives in the mind. She gripped the ribbon tighter, where she'd sewn it into the seam of her dress. I'll find him. Then you'll need more than prayer and hope. You'll need proof. You'll need witnesses. You'll need memory so sharp it cuts through lies. And you'll need to survive long enough to use it. 3 days later, the plantation owner fell ill with a fever that swept through the main house like divine judgment. Chills, a cough that rattled through the hallways like a death knell, weakness that kept him bedridden for a week. The doctor was called from town, but he was old and half-blind, so his assistant came instead, a young man named Caleb, who was new to the work, unsure of himself, fumbling with jars of medicine and instructions he only half remembered from his brief apprenticeship. She was sent to help in the main house and in the cabins with herb steam for the sick, moving quietly through both worlds. Listening, she heard Caleb muttering Latin terms aloud in the hallway, trying to remember dosages and procedures. She heard the overseer in the office below, talking about ledgers and debts with a creditor who'd come to collect. She stored it all, every word, every phrase, every detail, locking it into her memory the way she'd locked in her son's face, the sound of his voice, the feel of his hand in hers. Aunt Hester, the plantation midwife who delivered half the children in the quarters and knew more medicine than the town doctor ever would, watched her closely one evening as they prepared her bundles together. You're listening hard to everything, Hester observed, her hands steady as she tied dried leaves with thread. Memory's all I've got. Can't read, can't write, but I can remember. I can keep everything they say, everything they do, everything that might matter someday. Hester handed her a bundle of dried herbs, her eyes sharp and knowing. Then remember this. Pain sharpens the mind. Grief makes memory keen. Use it. Let it make you stronger instead of breaking you. That night, a patroller rode in just after dark, calling for head counts and checking tasks, making sure everyone was accounted for in the quarters. The overseer gathered the families in the yard under torchlight and made his threat clear, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. Anyone plots, anyone runs, anyone causes trouble, I'll burn every Bible and quilt on this place. I'll take every item of comfort you've managed to keep. You'll have nothing left but what I allow. You understand me? She kept her eyes down, her posture submissive, the ribbon hidden safely in the seam of her dress where no one would find it. Fear pressed against her ribs, made her heart race, but beneath it, something harder took shape. Strategy. Cold, patient strategy. She would survive long enough to find proof. She would outlast the threats. She would be smarter than the system that tried to erase her son. That night, thunder rolled across the plantation like divine anger. She dreamed vivid and strange of a road she'd never walked, a bend to the left where trees formed a natural arch, a fence post leaning at an odd angle, its wood weathered gray, a ferry pole in the distance, standing sentinel at a river crossing. She woke before dawn with the dream sharp and clear in her mind, and she added it to everything else she was keeping, another piece of a puzzle she couldn't yet see complete. A week later, after the plantation owner had recovered and routines had returned to normal, the preacher took her to a country chapel after curfew. Samuel came too, keeping watch near the row while the preacher unlocked a side door and led her down stone steps into a basement that smelled of old paper and dust. He opened a trunk carefully, its hinges creaking with age. Inside, quilts folded with care, old papers yellow with time, and a ledger with ink so faded it looked like shadow. The preacher ran his finger down a ledger line, squinting in the candlelight. Shipments south, names sometimes hidden in stitches. Codes sewn into quilt binding, messages passed through church networks. She leaned close, though she couldn't read the words. The letters were just shapes to her, meaningless symbols. Can you find my son's name? Maybe, but it might be listed wrong. Traders lie about ages to get better prices. Overseers lie about debts to justify sales. Paper lies because the people who write it are liars. She touched the quilt binding, tracing a pattern that looked almost like a map, roads and rivers rendered in thread. Then how do I ever know what's true? Details. Small things. Wax color on seals. Each county uses different colors. Seal depth. Official stamps press deeper than forgeries. Thread type. County clerks use specific thread for binding documents. These are the things liars forget to match. Lanterns swept the road outside, their light cutting through the basement window. They froze mid-breath, the trunk still open, papers exposed. She heard dogs huffing and sniffing, boots scraping the dirt path near the chapel. The preacher's hand hovered over the candle, ready to snuff it and plunge them into darkness. She hummed low, controlled, the same lullaby tempo she used every night. The dogs outside quieted almost immediately, as if the sound reached something primal in them. The boots moved on, footsteps fading. The preacher stared at her in the candlelight, his eyes wide. How did you do that? I don't know. It just works, always has. Animals respond to it. He closed the trunk carefully, his hands shaking slightly. After 1850, after the Fugitive Act, the law gets crueler about runaways and about people searching for family. Crossing state borders without proper proof becomes deadly. You'll need papers, real ones, official seals that can't be questioned. She nodded, gratitude mixing with urgency in her chest. Time was tightening like a noose around all of them, laws changing, systems hardening. At dawn, she returned to the plantation kitchen yard and saw the overseer burning scraps in a metal barrel, old letters, torn cloth, anything that might carry a message or a name or evidence of the illicit transactions everyone knew happened but no one acknowledged. Smoke rose thick and bitter, carrying the smell of destroyed evidence. She turned away and whispered her prayer again, the same words she'd spoken when they took her son. Lord, keep him breathing till I find him. The years crawled forward with agonizing slowness. The plantation owners' debts mounted, cotton prices falling, investments failing, creditors growing impatient. Papers were discussed in the main house office like chains around the owner's neck, threatening to pull everything under. The overseer promised to fix the records, and she watched from her position serving drinks in the hallway as he tied document bundles with green ribbon, the same color the trader had used that morning, 15 years ago. She memorized it all, the ribbon color, the way the overseer's hand shook when he lied to the creditor's face, the nervous tick in his jaw when difficult questions were asked, the beads of sweat on his forehead when the accounting didn't quite add up the way it should. War talk began in 1861, distant cannon rumors, soldiers marching on the road, news of battles filtering back through travelers and preachers. The plantation thinned as men were sent to fight or fled to avoid being sent. The overseer grew meaner as his control became more tenuous, his threats sharper, his punishments more arbitrary. She kept the ribbon from her son's sleeve hidden in her dress seam, sewn in so carefully it would take deliberate searching to find it. She hummed the lullaby every single night, never missing once, the tempo as consistent as her heartbeat. She scratched new details into the hidden board whenever memory offered them, names of people the trader mentioned, descriptions of places he said he'd be traveling, anything that might form a trail. 15 years passed. The world changed around her, but her purpose never wavered. Emancipation came in 1865, announced from a courthouse porch she couldn't see, delivered in words she could barely believe even as she heard them. Freedom arrived on paper, in proclamations, in laws that said the old system was dead. But freedom didn't bring restoration, freedom didn't bring her son back. Records were scattered across the South, letters moved slow when they moved at all, and hope grew thin as more time passed without answers. She stayed near the plantation, now a place of wages instead of chains, though the difference felt smaller than it should, and she searched. She asked every traveler who passed through, She questioned every preacher, every freedman, every person who might have information. Most shook their heads, some lied for money, claiming they knew something when they didn't. None had real answers, but she kept the ribbon sewn in her dress. She kept the prayer on her lips. She kept humming every night without fail. By 1870, she was 43 years old, her hands scarred from decades of work, her back bent from labor, but her voice still steady. She walked into the nearest town one spring morning and stood in the courthouse square, looking at the probate office, wondering if paper and law could ever tell the truth about what had been stolen, about what had been broken. The street bustled with market day activity, farmers selling corn and tobacco, women hawking eggs and bread, children darting between wagons and horses, dogs lounging in patches of shade. She moved through the crowd slowly, methodically, her eyes scanning faces the way they'd scanned faces every single day for 15 years. Most days, she saw nothing, strangers, people going about their lives with no connection to her story. Today, she saw a young man watching her from across the street with an intensity that made her pause. He was 19, maybe 20, tall and lean, his hands tucked in his pockets, his posture uncertain. He stared at her with an expression she couldn't quite name: recognition, maybe, or hope, or fear, or all three tangled together. She stopped walking. The church bell tolled noon, its sound echoing across the square. The young man stepped into the street, dodging a wagon loaded with hay, his eyes never leaving hers. When he reached her, he opened his mouth to speak, hesitated as if the words were too large to release, then spoke one trembling word: "Mom." The sound hit her like a physical blow. Her knees almost buckled. She grabbed the hitching post beside her, her breath gone, the world spinning. He stepped closer, his whole body shaking. I think I've been looking for so long." She couldn't speak. She could only stare at the tilt of his head, the shape of his jaw, the way his voice cracked on that single syllable. There was something in his eyes, something in the way he stood, that pulled at memory. A shopkeeper paused in his doorway, watching the scene with curiosity. A passing lawman slowed his horse, his hand moving instinctively toward his belt. The young man's hands rose, uncertain, reaching toward her. "I've been searching for years. I heard someone told me there was a woman here who used to hum." She found her voice, barely more than a whisper. "Hum what?" He swallowed hard, gathering courage. Then he hummed, low, steady, the exact tempo of the lullaby she'd sung every night for 15 years. Note for note, beat for beat, perfect. Her hand flew to her mouth. Tears broke free, hot and sudden, streaming down her face. The young man pulled something from his pocket with trembling fingers, a scrap of fabric, yellow-brown with age, frayed at the edges. A ribbon knot, kept and preserved all these years. "It's all I had," he whispered, his voice breaking, "all I remembered. The woman who raised me after I was sold the second time, she told me to keep it. She said someday it might matter." She reached for his sleeve, her fingers shaking, searching. There a small curved scar on his forearm, faded but still visible. The scar from when he'd fallen against the kitchen stove when he was 3 years old, when she'd held him while Hester dressed the burn and sang to calm his crying. "What happened to your arm?" she asked, her voice breaking into pieces. "I fell. When I was little, I don't remember much, but someone told me I cry, and a woman sang until I stop." She pulled him close, her hands gripping his shoulders, her forehead pressed to his chest. "Lord, you kept him breathing." The lawman dismounted, his boots hitting the dirt hard. "What's the matter here?" The young man straightened, keeping his arm around her shoulders. "We need the probate office. We need to see records." The lawman's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What kind of records?" "From before the war. Sales records, names. We need to prove who we are." The probate office was a brick building behind the courthouse, its windows narrow and barred, its door heavy oak with iron fittings. The clerk's assistant sat at a desk inside, shuffling papers with the bored efficiency of someone who'd done this job too long, barely looking up when they enter. "Help you?" he asked without enthusiasm. "We need records," the young man said, his voice stronger now. "From before the war, sales documentation, family names." The assistant frowned, finally looking at them fully. "Those records are misfiled, disorganized. The clerk's out today, can't help you." She stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the desk. A stack of papers sat to the left, tied with ribbon, green ribbon. Wax pressed into the corner of the top document, pale yellow to light, wrong shade for this county. She'd learned enough from the preacher to recognize the difference. Her stomach dropped with the weight of understanding. Someone's still hiding it, she whispered. The assistant's face went blank, carefully neutral. I don't know what you mean. The young man leaned on the desk, his hands pressed flat. We know what we're looking for, and we know what forged documents look like. The wax, the ribbon, the seal depth, we've been taught. The assistant glanced toward the back room, then back at them. Fear flickered in his eyes, quickly suppressed. After a long pause, he lowered his voice to barely audible. Come back after dark, bring a lantern, use the side door. That night, they returned to the church basement where the preacher kept his hidden archive. He brought the old trunk again, spreading quilts and ledger bundles across the stone floor in the candlelight. She ran her hand over a quilt binding, and her breath caught in her throat. The stitching pattern matched her dream from 15 years ago, the road bend, the leaning fence post, the ferry pole. The dream she'd thought meant nothing. This is it, she breathed. This is the map. I dreamed this. The young man leaned close, pointing to a symbol stitched into the corner, a small cross overlaid with a triangle. I know this mark. An old woman named Sarah, she took care of me when I was sold the second time, when I was 7. She showed me this symbol once, hidden in her cabin, and she said it meant safe passage in the network of people trying to keep families connected. The preacher nodded slowly, reverently. Providence leaves breadcrumbs for those patient enough to follow them. Thunder rumbled outside, distant but approaching. Rain began to tap against the chapel windows. Flood will take the bridge by morning if this keeps up, the preacher said, checking the sky through the basement window. If you're going to the county office tonight, you need to go now. Once that bridge is out, you'll be trapped on this side for days. She looked at her son, found after 15 years. He nodded without hesitation. They wrapped the quilt and ledger carefully in oilcloth to protect them from the rain and ran through the darkness. The river had risen significantly by the time they reached the landing, brown water churning against the wooden pilings, dragging debris downstream with frightening force. The ferry was the only way across, a flat barge pulled by rope and pole, dangerous in good weather and nearly suicidal in flood conditions. The boatman stood at his pole, his face weathered and deeply suspicious. He looked them up and down, noting their urgency, their wet clothes, the bundle they carried. Passes, he demanded. She handed over the paper she'd been given, that emancipation official, stamped, signed by union officer. The boatman squinted at the seal in his lantern light, then at her face, then back at the paper. This wax is the wrong color, he said flatly. Her pulse jumped. It's the seal they gave me at the freedman's office. The boatman glanced at the young man. And you, same office, same seal. We both got papers from the same place. The boatman grunted, unconvinced. Lot of forgeries these days, lot of people pretending to be free, and they're not. Lot of trouble if I ferry the wrong folks. She pointed to the ribbon on the paper, keeping her voice steady. Look at the thread, green thread. This county's official office uses blue thread for binding. Check the county records if you want. This paper came from somewhere else. The boatman hesitated, studying her face, weighing risks. Finally, he waved them aboard with clear reluctance. Fine. But if the deputy stops you on the other side, it's your trouble, not mine. I'm just the ferry. They climbed onto the barge. Fog rolled across the water, thick and cold, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The young man sat beside her on the wet boards, his hands clenched together, his breathing quick and shallow. Halfway across, a deputy hailed from the far bank, his voice cutting through fog and rain. Hold there, ferry, hold. The boatman slowed his poling, letting the current drift them closer to the far shore. The deputy stepped to the water's edge, his hand on his belt near his pistol. Passes. I need to see passes from both of you. She handed them over again, water dripping from her sleeves. The deputy studied the seals with a long, careful scrutiny, his eyes narrowing with each passing second. Behind him, dogs were released to hounds sniffing along the bank, trained to find runaways even though the war was over and slavery was supposedly ended. Old habits died hard in some places. The young man's breathing quickened beside her. She felt his fear, deep, instinctive fear that didn't care about papers or laws or emancipation proclamations. The fear of someone who'd been hunted before. She touched his hand gently. We do not turn back, not now, not ever. The deputy glanced over his shoulder at his partner, who was occupied with questioning another traveler trying to cross. He clearly didn't want the trouble of a delay, didn't want the paperwork, didn't want the complications. He ended the passes back roughly. "Go on, move." The ferry scraped against the far bank with a jarring thud. They stepped off quickly, the oilcloth bundle pressed tight to her chest, and disappeared into the fog-shrouded streets. The county office sat at the end of a narrow cobblestone street, its windows dark, its door locked. The clerk's assistant met them at the side entrance as promised, a shuttered lantern in his hand, his face pale with nervous fear. "Quick," he whispered urgently, "before someone sees you here." Inside, the office smelled of old paper, ink, and dust. He led them through a front room lined with filing cabinets and into a back storage area lined with shelves. He pulled a hidden ledger from behind a stack of property deeds, black leather, very old, its pages brittle with age. "This one's supposed to be destroyed," he said, his voice barely audible. "The clerk ordered it burned after the war, but I kept it. Something told me it might matter someday." She opened it carefully, terrified the pages might crumble. The entries were cramped, deliberately obscured, written in a hand that tried hard to hide what it was actually recording. Illicit sales, double recorded debts, children listed under false names to confuse anyone who might come searching later. Her eyes scanned the page, struggling to make sense of symbols she couldn't fully read. Then she saw it, a mark she recognized, a traitor symbol. The same red wheel with the split spoke she'd scratched into that hidden board 15 years ago. "The wagon that took her son. That's it," she breathed. "That's the wagon mark. I'd know it anywhere." The young man leaned over her shoulder, his breath quick. "What does the entry say?" The assistant read aloud in a halting voice. "Child, age 4, listed under assumed name Samuel, sold south via drum and trade route. Original debt recorded twice to fund unauthorized purchase. True name withheld to prevent recovery." Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped the ledger. "His name wasn't Samuel, his name was Jacob," the young man said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "They called me Samuel for almost 10 years. But I remembered. Deep down, I always remembered. My real name is Jacob." Footsteps echo in the main office. Someone was moving around up front, checking locks, closing shutters. The assistant's face went white. He shoved the ledger into their oilcloth bundle. "Take it. Go. If they catch you with this, we're all in danger. But it's the only proof you have." They slipped out the back entrance and ran through rain and darkness. The next morning dawned clear and cold. They stood on the courthouse steps with the torn ribbon, the hidden ledger, and the quilt spread at their feet on the stone. A crowd gathered quickly. Farmers come to town for market, merchants opening shops, freedmen hoping for work, former slaveholders uncomfortable with the new order. Word had spread overnight through the mysterious networks of small-town gossip. A woman and her son were challenging old records, demanding justice for a 15-year-old crime. A deputy stepped forward from the courthouse door, his face opally skeptical. "You're claiming fraud in official county records." She held up the ribbon, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "To seals, to different stories. Press the wax and compare them, see which one is real." The deputy glanced at the ledger, then at the growing crowd. "This is county business, private records. You've got no legal standing to challenge." Jacob stood beside her, his voice cutting through the deputy's objection. "She is my mother. I am her son. We had every right to the truth." The crowd murmured, voices rising, people pressing closer to see. An older townsman pushed through from the back, a man who'd lived here 40 years, who remembered the plantation, remembered the overseer, remembered the lies. His face was grim. "Let her speak," he said loudly. "I remember when that boy was sold. Something wasn't right about it then. Let her make her case." The deputy hesitated, caught between authority and public pressure. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Fine, but this better be quick and it better be provable." She knelt on the courthouse steps and carefully untied the green ribbon from the ledger. "This ribbon is green. The county seal office uses blue ribbon for all official documents, always has, for 30 years. This wax is shallow, barely pressed. The county seal ring presses deep enough to leave clear vine and cross details. Someone forged these papers to hide a sale that was illegal even under the laws of that time." The deputy picked up the ribbon between two fingers, studying it closely. "How do you know what the county seal looks like if you can't read?" "I've seen it, once, 15 years ago, when they processed the sale papers in front of me. I remember everything about that day. I've remembered it every day since. The preacher from the chapel pushed through the crowd, holding something wrapped in cloth. He was the same man who'd shown her that hidden archive, who'd taught her about seals and wax and the small details that revealed truth. "This is the official county seal ring," he announced, unwrapping it for everyone to see. "Kept in the church vault for safekeeping since the war ended. Press it beside hers and compare." The deputy took the ring with visible reluctance. He pressed it carefully into fresh wax on the courthouse steps, making an impression for everyone to witness. The impression was deep, clean, detailed, a cross overlaid with vine leaves, every line crisp. He took the ribbon-bound paper and pressed that wax beside the fresh impression. Shallow, crooked, wrong, missing details. The crowd pressed closer, craning to see. Gasps and murmurs spread through the assembly. The preacher hummed one note low, steady, the same pitch she'd used to quiet dogs that night 15 years ago. The crowd hushed almost magically, as if the sound itself called them to witness truth. The deputy stared at the two impressions side by side. His jaw worked. Finally, he spoke. "Bring the county clerk." Now, the clerk arrived 20 minutes later, the real one, pulled from his home, his face flushed with anger at being summoned. He carried the official seal ring and a current ledger under his arm. Two seals were pressed side by side on a clean board on the courthouse steps, witnessed by over 100 people. The forgery's failure was undeniable. The clerk's face went pale as milk. He looked at the crowd, then at the deputy, then back at the evidence, his mouth open and closed soundlessly. Records were adjusted. He finally admitted in a voice barely audible. "Years ago, under pressure from creditors, to hide irregularities." The crowd's silence broke like a dam. Voices rose angry, demanding, shocked, hungry for more truth. The preacher lifted the quilt and spread it dramatically across the courthouse steps. "Now we open the binding. There's more." He used a small knife to carefully loosen the quilt's binding stitches. Hidden inside the fold of fabric was a piece of aged paper, protected from light and air, its ink still readable. A manumission clause, a promise, an oath. The preacher read aloud, so everyone could hear. "Any child sold under false debt recording shall be restored to family upon presentation of proof. So sworn and sealed, this day before witnesses, at families severed by fraud may be made whole again." Jacob's breath caught audibly. "That's us. That's our case." An old antagonist pushed forward roughly from the back of the crowd, a man who'd profited significantly from the plantation's debt system, who bought land cheap when the estate collapsed. His face was red with fury. "That's trash," he shouted, pointing at the quilt. "Burn it. It's not legal evidence." But other townsmen stepped between him and the courthouse steps, forming a human barrier. Younger men, freedmen, even some former Confederates who'd grown tired of lies. The clerk set his pen down with a trembling hand. "Read the specific ledger entry with the child's name." Out loud, the hidden ledger was opened to the marked page. The clerk read in a shaking voice. "Child, age 4, birth name Jacob, name forcibly changed to Samuel upon sale. Sale funded by deliberate double recording of plantation debt. Payment documentation forged by overseer to maintain false bondage status. True parentage deliberately obscure." The crowd erupted. Shock turned to anger. Anger turned to shame for those who'd been complicit. Shame turned to demands for justice. The clerk looked at her, his eyes filled with something between guilt and resignation. The debt recording was fraudulent. The sale was illegal under the laws that existed even then. The bond should never have been broken. She gripped Jacob's hand so hard her fingers went white. "Then fix it now." In front of everyone, the clerk dipped his pen carefully in fresh ink. "Who will sign as witness for the old estate? Who will acknowledge the fraud?" A representative from the estate's current ownership stepped forward reluctantly, a nephew of the original owner, clearly cornered by the weight of public witness and undeniable evidence. "I'll sign. The estate acknowledges the fraud. We void the debt claim." The clerk prepared new documents, writing with meticulous care, conscious of 100 pairs of eyes watching every stroke. He pressed the correct seal deep, clear, official. He slid the paper forward on the makeshift desk. "Step here. State your full names." She stepped forward. Jacob stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. The clerk pointed to the signature line with his pen. "Your name. I don't write, then speak it clearly. I'll write it for you. These witnesses will confirm." She spoke her name aloud, the name she'd carried all her life, the name her son had forgotten, but would now remember forever. The clerk wrote it down in clear, careful script. Jacob signed beside her signature, his hand shaking so badly the letters were barely legible, but they were there, real, permanent. The seal was pressed one final time. Green wax, properly mixed this time, deep impression, official, legal, true. The clerk lifted the paper high and read aloud. Bond of separation hereby declared void. Mother and son recognized by law. Names corrected in official record. Fraudulent dead void. Family status restore. The crowd stood in absolute silence for 3 heartbeats. Then someone began to clap, others joined. The sound built like a wave. The preacher raised both hands. Come to the church porch, all of you. We'll sing a hymn of witness. This truth needs to be sealed not just in wax, but in memory. The crowd followed slowly, uncertainly, but they followed. Over 100 people walking together from courthouse to church. On the wide church porch, she stood beside Jacob, the ribbon now tied around his wrist where everyone could see it not as a wound anymore, but as a marker of return, of restoration, of justice finally achieved. The preacher began a hymn. The crowd joined, their voices rising together discordant at first, then finding harmony. She hummed the lullaby tempo beneath it all, steady and sure as it had been for 15 years. Jacob's voice found hers. They sang together, and for the first time in 15 years, the word mom finally sounded like home.